Blessings, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. It's going to be a little different for this episode of my podcast because I don't have a guest, and I'm also going to do a sort of movie review. I've been wanting to do like deep dives into some of my favorite films for a while now. What's probably hindered me is just the amount of research I have to do ahead of time. Although these are films that I watched 100 times and I'm very familiar with. It's a lot of background research. I wanted to narrow it down to a certain theme of movies that I chose to discuss rather than just have it be random. And the theme that I wanted to explore, not surprisingly, is one that I've done a lot of in my writing and my podcasting, and that's the father-son relationship. The first movie I picked is The Robe from 1953. That's a movie I sort of have a long history with. I saw it first as a child. My dad was an immigrant from Sicily, and he came to the United States in the early 50s when a lot of this biblical craze began, and I'll talk that a little more. And so he saw a lot of these movies on the big screen. Of course, I didn't. I wasn't born until 69. But by the late 70s, like 79, 80, and I remember that's when the VCR revolution took place and people bought these big, huge hulking machine that you plopped on top of your sort of cabinet TVs, and they could play those big cassettes, and people watched movies from home. And that was a big deal back then. And my dad had bought one, and of course he bought a lot of these biblical epics, the Robe, Samson and Delilah, the Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur. So I grew up with those films, and it had a big effect on me. And I remember the Robe as a child, and then when I got older, I watched it again and bought the DVD and the Blu-ray and continued to enjoy the movie. I usually watch it probably once a year, maybe around Easter time. So let's take a deep dive into The Robe. Here is the movie poster for The Robe. These were called one sheets, I believe. The movie posters in the golden age of Hollywood were works of art. I'm telling you, they were incredible. And compared to what we have now. So The Robe was from 20th Century Fox. It was in Technicolor, which was started in the 1940s. But it was in something called Cinemascope, and this was the first film to be in Cinemascope. What that was we're familiar with it now, but they weren't in 1953. It is the widescreen format. So when you watch a widescreen film, most films, although they're not as widescreen as they were in Cinemascope, you have the black bar when you watch those on TV from a DVD or Netflix. You have a black bar on the top or bottom on the TV, and that's to fit that widescreen onto your television set, which is more round, although they're square, although they're becoming much more rectangular. When I was a kid, the TV screen was square. Now, before The Robe, you had that more square format. You think of The Wizard of Oz. So when those movies from the 30s and 40s reappeared on TV in the 1950s, they fit rather well into that square format. Now, CinemaScope, you have to remember, came about. You have to look at it in its historical context in the early 1950s. Now, what was taking place in entertainment in the early 1950s? You had the rise of television. So you had TV shows like I Love Lucy and The Lone Ranger, and people were staying home more and more and not going to the theater because it was cheaper. You had to buy a TV, but you didn't have to pay to watch a program. So people were not going to the box office, and the box office dropped. So the movie industry came up with new gimmicks, you could say, to draw the audiences back. CinemaScope was one of them, 3D, and just big movie spectacles in the 1950s. This is where the phrase "and a cast of thousands" came out, where you had big sets, and usually they were these biblical type films, and The Robe was one of them. Widescreen, Here's an example of the widescreen process. This, I think, from the Robe really shows how much of the screen is just filmed. Because you got to remember, before this, you had a rather probably scare a square, and you would have missed like all this and all this. So it's impressive, and you didn't get this on television. I've often compared the Cinemascope uh, process or phenomena to Baroque art. Now, Baroque art came about after the Protestant Reformation, and the Catholic Church in the West lost a lot of people. So Baroque art, I think, in a sense, was an answer to Protestantism, which, in a number of its forms was anti-art. And the Baroque art was big. It was like Cinemascope. It filled your eyes. It was gold. It was ornate. It was painted ceilings with cherubs and angels floating down out of the sky. It drew people back. I think that was the intention of the Catholic Church, was to draw people back to the church, because it was an experience that you could get nowhere else, certainly when compared to Protestantism. And that's what the movie industry was trying to do in the 1950s, bring people back into the theaters. Now, the film, like a lot of these biblical epics, was based on, I'm not talking about the biblical epics more. They were based on books, or not, a novel. And The Robe was written by Lloyd C. Douglas, who was a Lutheran, American Lutheran minister. And some of his probably his most famous works, of course, are The Robe, The Big Fisherman, which was sort of a sequel to The Robe. It was about St. Peter, and Magnificent Obsession, which is interesting. I've never read the book, but I've seen the movie, of course, several times. Douglas Sirk, the famous director, who had a very distinct style, very famous in the 1950s for making these melodramas. Directed Magnificent Obsession in 1954 with Jane Wyman and a young Rock Hudson, very famous, successful movie. Not a, I guess you wouldn't call it a religious movie, but it just really had spiritual aspects to it. And I would encourage people to see it. I like the movie. Now, the early editions of The Robe were illustrated by Dean Cornwell. Here you see his name, and he's a famous American illustrator. They're magnificent. I think for a long time, except maybe for the past 20, 30 years, illustration art was considered a lesser art form, like a craft, not high art, not museum, caliber art. I think that's been revised now, and I think people see these artworks for what they are. And this is an early illustration. I think I'll argue that, and I have some examples of the stills from The Robe, from the movie, that Cornwell's work influenced the cinematography of the film, because you'll see certain shots that look exactly like this. And here's another magnificent illustration by Dean Cornwell from The Robe. Truly great works of art. Now, the main character in the film is Marcellus Gallio, and he's based, I would say, on Saint Longinus, who was the Roman soldier traditionally that is depicted in art as piercing the side of Christ during the crucifixion. Here you see, this is a very early 6th century. Looks like an illumination. So here, this is probably Longinus right here. This is later, not sure, I'm guessing possibly Byzantine, mid to late Byzantine. So here you've got Longinus, probably here. And this is a Russian icon. I thought it was beautiful of Longinus, Saint Longinus. Quo Let's talk about the biblical epic. So Quo is from 1951. This is before the Cinemascope era. This is, I would argue, sort of the beginning of the religious biblical epic craze in Hollywood. Like The Robe, Quo is based on a novel. The director is Mervyn LeRoy here. He is, coincidentally enough, a Jewish director. Again, a magnificent one-sheet poster from the film. And I would say that Quo sort of served as an outline for later films, or features an outline that's picked up by later films. And what I mean by that is oftentimes you had a Roman, usually pagan protagonist, male. In this movie, it was Robert Taylor as a Roman centurion here. And then you all usually had an evil ruler, oftentimes a Roman emperor. In this movie, it's Nero, played by Peter Ustinov, and it's a great, it's a great role. It's magnificent. It's worth watching the film just to see him. And then you usually have like a persecuted minority, the Christians, typically. And that usually included a beautiful ingenue, Christian girl. And in this movie, it was Deborah Carr as a Christian, and Robert Taylor, of course, falls in love with her, and that's the story. This movie, again, was like very much the cast of thousands. You see it here, the most colossus ever. So this was an experience that you could not get at home on the television. You had to go to the screen. Now, actually, an earlier, got to pay homage to Cecil B. DeMille and his 1932 film, The Sign of the Cross. This is called, I'm going to talk about this a little bit. This is called Pre-Code. I've seen the film a couple of times, a bit, racy. And Pre-Code was, we'll talk about that. They got away with more, in terms of violence and sexual explicitness, I would say, because the film industry was not quite really self-regulating at this time. I'm not talking about pornography. This would probably be a PG movie now, but for 1932, it was a bit racy, and probably the high point of the biblical. I should say, The Sign of the Cross has a very, very similar plot line to Quo Vadis. I mean, almost identical. You had Nero and a Christian girl and a Roman soldier who falls in love with her. But probably the high point of the biblical genre in the 1950s was not coincidentally Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 version of the Ten Commandments, which was in VistaVision. And that was, VistaVision was kind of a ripoff because 20th Century Fox, as far as I know, had the copyright on Cinemascope, on the process and the name. So, to compete, the other studios came up with sort of their versions, and Paramount had VistaVision, then you had Technorama, then you had Tadeo, then you had Super Panavision. So you had all these different versions of Cinemascope. Now, the director of The Robe was Henry Koster, who also directed another favorite film of mine is the story of Ruth, which I really like. Henry Koster was a Jewish-born emigre. Um, I mention this because I think lately in social media, there's been a lot of discussion over the overrepresentation of Jews in the entertainment industry. Um, I would say less so now, but certainly in what we would call the golden age of Hollywood or in early Hollywood. And that the reason for that's are complicated. I think part of it has to do with a lot of early Hollywood figures came out of vaudeville, and vaudeville was very much a part of vaudeville had a lot of I don't know how to say it. Um, Vaudeville, especially in New York, um, had a lot of Jewish participation in it. So that's, I think, one of the reasons, why that was so. So, and you also have to look at this the studio system, which I'm putting the dates from about 1934 to 1968, and probably the height of the studio system in Hollywood was the 40s into the 50s, and then certainly in the 60s it was in decline and collapse. What the studio system was is you had the big movie studios. I mean, Metro Goldwyn Mayer is probably the most famous, MGM. What the studios did is the movie industry self-regulated itself through a process of censorship. And that was, at the time, it was called the Hays Code. So there were certain things that movies would not depict or would not depict explicitly or graphically. And it was certainly, violent or sexual content. And this coincided with the studio system. Probably an early reformer was another Jewish guy, Irving Thalberg, who was at MGM, because I think in the early 30s, in that pre-code period, which I mentioned, things had gone a bit out of control, and the movie industry did pull back. And then you had the golden age of Hollywood, which what I would argue were quite moral and uplifting films. When you do have the breakdown of morality is when you had the collapse of the studio system in the late 1960s. Okay. And in the 1970s, when the studio system is gone, is when you really had a proliferation of pornographic, violent sexual content. And I wanted to focus on three movies and three directors, which I think were instrumental in that very sadistic and disgusting films, especially because they involve the sexual exploitation of children. And they are Death in Venice from 1971, which was directed by Italian Catholic, the Luciano Visconti. That's from 1971. From 1976, you had Taxi Driver with Jodie Foster, and that was directed by Italian American Catholic director Martin Scorsese. And then in 1978, Pretty Baby with Brooke Shields, and that was directed by French Catholic director Louis Malle. So it is what it is. Let's see. Some other films that Henry Koster directed were The Bishop's Wife, which is one I actually really like. That's with Loretta Young and Cary Grant. I usually watch that around Christmas time. That's a great movie. A Man Called Peter, and The Story of Ruth, this one from 1960, which I really like too. I wish they put it out on Blu-ray. They haven't. It's only on regular DVD. Okay, let's jump into the actual film and the characters. The protagonist, the main character, is Marcellus Gallia that we talked about, And he's played by Richard Burton, who was 28 years old when he was offered the part. He was born in 1925 in Wales, so he's Welsh, to a coal mining family. His mother died when he was 2 years old. He was the 12th of 13 children. He was raised primarily by an older sister and his alcoholic father. Rough childhood. Um, he was seen as an intelligent child. He had a knack for acting, and at a young age, so as a young man, he was already on the English stage, and he appeared in some British films. But I would say The Robe was his breakout role. Here he is, and this is, you have to remember, this is pre Elizabeth Taylor, so they had not met or began their relationship. Something interesting here that Henry Coster said: I always was very much interested in religion, and I still am. I'm the only Jew, I think, who goes regularly to church. I've never been to temples, but then I wasn't brought up that way. My parents were not very good Jews. I never realized I was a Jewish until Adolf Hitler came in. And the female lead in the movie, the ingenue, I guess you could say, was played by Jean Simmons, and she played the character of Diana. She was born in 1929, an English actress. At that point, probably her most famous role was as Ophelia in Laurence Olivier's 1948 version of Hamlet. And at the time, she was married to English actor Stuart Granger. Beautiful portrait. People had, like they say, people have faces back then. Okay. Victor Mature, probably one of my least favorite actors. He played the role of Demetrius, he is Marcel Scalio's slave. Victor Mature was 40 years old at the time the movie was made. He was born in 1939. Up till then, probably his most famous role was in Cecil B. DeMille's 1949 version of Samson and Delilah, probably one of the worst performances in film history. It's too bad because Hedy Lamarr and George Sanders were wonderful in that movie. Great. And I think his bad performance, I think, overshadowed theirs. And not to be beating up on Victor Mature, this is what he said. When he was applying for membership in the swank Los Angeles Country Club, at the height of his fame, Mature was turned down and told that the golfing facility did not accept actors as members. His response: I'm an actor. And his response was, I'm not an actor, and I've got 64 films to prove it. Well, he had a sense of humor. It wasn't a great written part, and maybe a really good actor could have done something with it, but he just, wasn't. Michael Rennie, one of my favorite actors, another English actor. Michael Rennie played Peter. Honestly, he wasn't given much to do in this movie. He could act. He probably his most famous role to date was in The Day the Earth Stood Still. He also did a movie that I really like. It was a Buena Vista movie, which was a studio. It was kind of interesting. So Disney, Walt Disney was doing some, Walt Disney, who I don't like his animated films for a lot of reasons. But through this Buena Vista Studios in the 1950s and into the 60s, he did some really interesting movies, primarily made in England with a lot of English actors. And Michael Rennie did a movie with them called Third Man in the Mountain. And it's very cool. It's not a father-son movie, but it has some sort of dynamic. Because James MacArthur, who people probably remember from Hawaii Five-O, was a young man in the movie who had lost his father, who was a famous mountain climber. I don't want to get too much on a detour, but his father had died, and he wanted to be a mountain climber, and his mother doesn't want him to be because she's very cloying and protective. And then Michael Rennie comes into the picture as this famous mountain climber. He kind of mentors him, and it's a great movie. It was, again, it was built, it was based on a movie, on a, excuse me, on a novel. I should say, let me go back really quick. Michael Rennie does have some really good scenes in The Robe, and we'll talk about that. It's not a big part. It's a supporting part at best. It's small. Another good actor was Dean Yeager, who's in the movie. He plays an early follower of Christ, sort of an early disciple of him. And Dean Yeager had primarily been a character actor, which we don't see much of anymore. People all want to be a leading man or a leading lady. Character actors were sort of secondary um, in films. They were supporting players. And in Hollywood in that golden era, you had actors that specialized in doing that. They might have played leads in a movie, but very rarely. And Dean Yeager was one of those people. Um, Jay Robinson, a bunch of the people, Jeff Morrow, Torrin Thatcher, that I'll talk about in a minute, they were character actors at that time. So Gene Yeager, you probably remember from White Christmas, and also interesting enough, he plays the father. This is a movie I would actually like to do a deep dive into, which is The Nun Story, which isn't. It's not really a father. It's not at all a father-son story, but there's a father-daughter aspect to that movie that I think is critical. And he played the dad to Audrey Hepburn in The Nun Story. Okay, Jay Robinson plays Caligula. It's an incredible performance. It got sort of knocked at the time as being over the top. And I think there is points that it could be camp, but how do you play Caligula? I mean, how do you play this perverted, sadistic, mad emperor? And I think Jay Robinson was incredible. This was actually his first film role, and he was only 23 at the time. It's a great movie. He didn't have, after this illustrious debut, he didn't have a big film career, which is too bad. It's just, this is towards the end of the movie. I just thought this was a great still of Jay Robinson as Caligula. Another favorite actor of mine, Jeff Morrow. He plays Roman centurion. He's a battle-tested guy, rose through the ranks, very different from Marcellus Gallio, who I know we're going to talk about the characters. Marcellus Gallio is the son of a Roman senator, and who there's a lot of favoritism here. So the character played by Jeff Morrow is very different from him. Interestingly enough, Jeff Morrow would also appear in Henry Coster's The Story of Ruth, which I really like. That was a better role for him, bigger role. Lastly, Torrin Thatcher, British actor. He was very much a working actor, I would say, a character actor. Did a lot of films. Um, Probably, well known, but probably not famous, not necessarily a leading man. One of the movies that he did that I liked from a kid was from 1962, Jack the Giant Killer, which I encourage people to see, where he played this evil warlock. Oh, Betta St. John. Oh man, what a beauty. She was also very much a supporting actress in her film career. She never, she never really moved on to leading lady status. I remember looking at my notes. An interesting movie she did was Tarzan the Magnificent from 1960, where she played this very unhappy wife of a weak, frightened husband. It was an interesting role for her. It's another scene, pivotal scene from the movie. I've got some info on Betta St. John. She quit acting in the early 1960s. She said, I thought my career was long enough, and I didn't feel I was giving up very much at that point, she said. But I gave it up mainly because I wanted to stay home and raise the children, and my family was very much more important to me. Betta St. John. I think she passed away just recently. Okay, let's get into the film. Marcellus Gallio, a playboy libertine, a tribune within the Roman army. His father is a senator. His dad is very stoic, very responsible. The focus of the film, I think, is this psychological transformation which takes place in Marcellus Gallio. And it's beautifully portrayed by Richard Burton. It took a great actor, I think, to pull off this role. And Richard Burton was a great actor. Early on in the film, you see his sort of libertine lifestyle of partying, drunken revelry. This is, I think, the opening of the movie, and we see Marcellus at the Roman slave market where he goes to purchase these twin slaves. He doesn't win them. They're bid on by a representative of Caligula. And this is where you first see the conflict in the film between Marcellus and Caligula. There's an interesting sort of back and forth with someone at the slave market, a woman that I guess he was involved with as sort of a former girlfriend, and she's berating him for being at her party, for being drunk, for being loudmouth, for saying things about Caligula in public that he shouldn't have done. So he's a loose cannon, and he's a problem. So as a result of this, he's exiled to Judea, which was not a great assignment for a Roman soldier at that time. Now, when he goes to Judea, this is sort of there was an interesting scene in sort of this Roman bathhouse. The Romans very much appreciated public bathing. It was not a luxury, it was sort of a necessity for them. If you've ever been to Rome, go to the baths of Carcalla, which is enormous. That's a much later, that's oh my gosh, that's probably second century, late second century. And the baths of Carcalla were seen as a place where everyday Romans or Romans of the highest social status could go, and it would be this luxurious experience with gardens and statues and mosaics, and you got to partake in these public baths. It was separated by the sexes, males and females, the two sexes. And so bathing was a big part of Roman culture. So we see Marcellus Gallio in Judea, but here he is at the Roman baths with his slave Demetrius, who he bought at the slave market in Rome. And Demetrius, of course, accompanies him to Judea. In the book, people always say this, oh, the book is better than the film. That's not always true. But I have to say, in case of the Robe, it's very much true. The book is wonderful. I love the book. Part of the book that I really like is the relationship between Demetrius and Marcellus, which is really cool the way you can't flesh these things out in a movie that's an hour and a half to 2 hours long, but you can in a book. Although it's interesting that there was a movie from I think 2011 called The Eagle with Channing Tatum and Jamie Bell, and that was the same sort of storyline with a Roman soldier and his slave. And I think the relationship in that movie between those two men is really developed in an interesting way. But that was more of the focus of that movie. In this movie, it isn't. So it could have been done, but it just wasn't because there are a lot of other stories. You have Peter, and then you have Marcellus's involvement with Diana, played by Gene Simmons. So the relationship between Demetrius and Marcellus is not the focus of the movie, but it's not really developed. And I think in the end, that causes problems. Now, what brings Marcellus to this sad state of affairs where he's exiled to Judea, really disgraced by Caligula, by this assignment? It's a punishment. The Robe is very much, especially in the beginning, it's a story about a son living in the shadow of his great father. And Marcellus's father, like I said, is a Roman senator, but a very respected one. And Marcellus is not following in his father's footsteps, who, like I said, is very stoic, very measured, very respected. And Marcellus is the prodigal son. You saw this plot line play out in Roman history, and I would say most explicitly in the relationship between Marcus Aurelius and Commodus. It's been primarily, I mean, you see that in films, and most famously in Gladiator with Russell Crowe, where you had Joaquin Phoenix play Commodus, wonderfully. And that was a great performance. And you had Marcus Aurelius played by Richard Harris. And that was very much a great father and a not so great son. Although in that case, Commodus, especially as depicted in the film, Gladiator is psychotic. I mean, Marcellus is not psychotic. He's a good man, but he is, like I said, living under the shadow of a great father. And in this early scene in the Robe, when Marcellus gets his orders to leave for Judea, his father is clearly disappointed, and you see it. This was another really, this early scenes are really beautiful in the movie. So this is Marcellus, his father, his mother, and sister, who his sister had a more interesting role in the book. She just has no role here, really. And his father is greatly disappointed. His father is greatly disappointed in his son. So when Marcellus is in Judea, in the Holy Land, he is the centurion in charge of the crucifixion of Christ. He doesn't actually pierce the side of Christ, but he is there, and the blood. It's another beautiful scene. The blood from Christ's wound ends up on Marcellus, and that's the beginning of that's really the beginning of this psychological conflict which takes place in him. Although you could say it was present before, this is when it's really explicitly displayed. After the crucifixion, Marcellus is recalled to Rome, and somebody pulled strings back with the emperor, and he returns. There's an interesting scene with him and Gene Simmons as Diana, and the actor who played and the actor who played the Emperor Claudius. And Claudius was, in historical accounts, was a monster, was a pervert, and he's actually showed as quite a sort of benevolent older man in this movie, which is interesting. With takes a liberty with the historical account, and he sends Marcellus back to the Holy Land to find this robe that they think bewitched him, because after the crucifixion, the robe is inadvertently placed, the robe of Christ is inadvertently placed on him. So this great scene takes place in the movie when Marcellus tracks down Demetrius, who escaped and is now with Peter and is, and is a follower of Jesus, a Christian. And he touches the robe and he has this conversion. This is actually my favorite part of the movie, I think, in terms of sort of healing the father wound, because I think you could say Marcellus had that. He didn't have an abusive dad, but he certainly had an overcritical, probably neglectful dad. If you think his father was a Roman senator, I mean, he wasn't around much. And it looks like when he is there to criticize his son, and his son is acting out. And you see that today in modern times with young men who get involved with violence or gang activity, or just any sort of sexual promiscuity, pornography. This acting out you see, and that's where Marcellus is at. So after his conversion, after touching the robe, he meets Peter, and there's this really beautiful scene. It's sort of like where the prodigal son goes home to the dad, and Marcellus confesses, you could say, confesses to Peter that he was involved with the crucifixion of Christ, and he's looking for forgiveness, and it's a beautiful scene. Here's another still, and Peter forgives Marcellus, but he also talks in the process of that. He, says how he betrayed Christ and fled uh, when Jesus had been arrested. And so it's a beautiful scene between these two men who had been wounded and who had been, renewed uh, through their love for Jesus. It's really beautiful. Here's another scene. I was looking for all different shots from that particular scene in the movie, and it's really kind of comes at the middle of the film, and it's very much the turning point for Marcellus, where a lot of the shame and the guilt that he had been carrying around is finally healed, and he's relieved. And it's also through, like, you could also argue that it's through his relationship with Peter and in becoming a Christian and his love for Christ that those father wounds are healed. And I think in the book it's more explicit, because after um, uh, Marcellus is converted, he leaves on this journey with Demetrius and Peter throughout the Mediterranean, from Judea to Rome, and it shows their relationship and the relationship that they have with other people, with other Christians along the way, and it's beautifully written. That part is completely missing from the film. So Marcellus does end up back in Rome in the catacombs, of course, and he is reunited with Diana. And this is another, I think, interesting aspect of the film that I think portrays the wounded man who's been hurt by his father, and how healing can take place not solely, but through a relationship with a good woman, through that loving relationship. And he has that with Diana. Although when they are reunited, she doesn't really get it. Um, she's a pagan, a Roman, and he's now a Christian, and she doesn't understand where he's coming from. But because of her love for him, she tries to understand his newfound faith. Now, there's also a meeting between Marcellus and his father, and this is a great picture because his dad's pissed. He's still upset because now his wayward son, his playboy son, comes back from Judea, a Christian. So it's like worse and it's like worse and worse. He's a traitor. The scenes between Richard Burton and Torrin Thatcher, between father and son, they're not long in the Robe during this part of the film. And there you see James Simmons playing Diana in the background. She was wonderful. They're very low key, they're very understated. And I think that's very indicative of father-son relationships. There's not a lot of shouting, there's not a lot of screaming, there's not a lot of drama, there's not a lot of carrying on. But the father is quiet and upset and seething and so incredibly disappointed in his son. And Richard Burton is very much aware that his dad is completely unhappy with him, and in that scene wipes his hands of him, doesn't want anything to do with his son anymore. I mean, but it's through Christianity that uh, Marcellus has had this new revelation, and he has sort of a new family. So I think he's heartbroken by it, but I think he's able to go on because later he really gives up his life for Demetrius, who's part of his new Christian family. There's a beautiful scene. I want to go back real quickly because there's these really wonderful little scenes in the movie, and this is between Richard Burton and Betta St. John. You can see the influence, I think, from the Dean Cornwall illustrations. But Betta St. John plays a young woman who's disabled. She's unable to walk, but she has a beautiful voice, and she's very beautiful looking. And she met Christ as a child, but Christ did not heal her and physically, but he transformed her spiritually and mentally because she was a very depressed, morose, melancholic person before she met Christ. And after that, she was able to cope with her disability and where she was. And I think you see that in Marcellus too, where although things are very bad with his father, still after his conversion, he's able to cope with it. Now, I love the end of the movie because all these intersections and all these stories are resolved. Marcellus is, a committed Christian, and he's willing. At that time, that meant willing to give up your life. So he's brought before Caligula, and he refuses to renounce Christ. And there's this wonderful scene with the robe, and he gives it to Diana. His father is there. It's very touching, and it affects me to this day. So Marcellus's father is there watching as his son is put on trial. It's a great little scene between Jay Robinson as Caligula and Richard Burton, where they're sort of debating, and Marcellus makes a good point. and his father is in the background in the audience, in the gallery, I guess you could say, or the audience, and he smiles, and his son made a good point. He's proud of his son, I guess, at that time because he was a senator, and in the Senate was all about debate, and it's a beautiful little scene, little moment. So it's really between, you see at the end of the film that this relationship between Marcellus and Diana is so fundamental to each of them because Marcellus is sentenced to death, and rather than live without him, um, Diana insults Caligula and gets herself sentenced to death as well. So it's this beautiful relationship between these two people. Okay, so this is the final scene from the movie. This is a still from the Robe. I actually I love this so much that I looked on eBay and actually found it. This particular still. So what's going on is Marcellus and Diana are being led away after being condemned to death by Caligula, and Marcellus sees his father. I'm gonna get all. Oh my God, it really hits me hard. And again, it's a beautifully played scene. There's no dialogue between them oftentimes, which plays out in father-son relationships, but his dad just reaches out to him, and his son looks back at his father, and it's sort of this unspoken dialogue between father and son, and the dad is saying to him, you did good, and goodbye, and I love you. It's a beautiful, 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 beautifully done. And I think that the conflict between father and son, which isn't the focus of the movie, but it's very much an undercurrent throughout it. It's resolved. I love it. It's a great film, beautifully acted, um, beautiful cinematography. If I have critiques of it, is it's it's um it's probably too brief. I think it could have been longer. It could have been like Ben-Hur at 3.5 hours. The Robe is 2 hours and 15 minutes. It doesn't seem that long. It seems pretty short because I don't know if it's because the screen is so jam-packed with stuff going on. It just doesn't seem that long compared to, like, say, the Ten Commandments or Ben-Hur. I think it maybe could have benefited from a bit longer length. But I think for what they had and what they did, there's a lot. There's a lot that's wonderful about the Robe. So of course, I encourage people to watch it, and I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the Robe, and I hope to do some other films in the future. God bless you.